At a dusty Kansas airfield, a hotshot pilot mocked an elderly black nun beside a weathered Cessna. "Sister, you look lost. Bingo Hall's in town," he laughed. "Fly that coffin, name the stakes," she smiled. "Let's settle it in the air." Minutes later, engines roaring, they raced around 3 water towers. He didn't know she'd once commanded a wing of F-16s, logged over 3,000 combat hours, and retired a 2-star general. As his prized plane trailed black smoke, she radioed, "Son, call your mechanic." By touchdown, his reputation and his engine were both finished. "Don't go anywhere." That pilot had no idea he just challenged a woman who once commanded squadrons of fighter jets in combat zones across Iraq and Afghanistan. Sister Mary Clarence hadn't flown a Cessna in 30 years. She'd flown F-16s. And the truth hiding under that nun's habit was a secret so carefully guarded that even her own convent didn't fully know who they'd been praying beside. Here is what happened before that race. Her name was not always Sister Mary Clarence. For 26 years, she was Colonel Vanessa Cross, call sign Valkyrie, and she was one of the most decorated fighter pilots ever to strap into an F-16 Fighting Falcon. She logged over 3,000 flight hours in combat zones. She flew close air support missions during the Gulf War, enforced the no-fly zone over Bosnia, and commanded a full wing out of Aviano Air Base before being promoted to Brigadier General and then Major General. Her pilots called her the Ice Queen because she never shouted, never panicked, and never missed a target. She retired with a Legion of Merit, a Distinguished Flying Cross, and a Bronze Star. And then she walked away from all of it to take a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and enter a convent. What made a 2-star general trade her flight suit for a habit? There was an afternoon in April of 2003. Major General Cross was 2 months into her first posting at the Pentagon, tasked with planning the first coordinated airstrikes of the Iraq invasion. She had pulled an all-nighter reviewing target folders when a young captain knocked on her office door, handed her an envelope, and said simply, "Ma'am, you're not going to believe this." Inside was a grainy photograph taken by a Predator drone over Baghdad. It showed a residential neighborhood, a school, and a small chapel with a cross on the roof, tucked behind 3 water towers. The same 3 water towers her grandfather had helped build as an engineer 40 years earlier. She stared at the image for 7 minutes without moving. The next day, she walked into her commanding officer's office and handed in her resignation. 2 years later, she entered the Sisters of the Immaculate Heart, a small order in Wichita that ran a soup kitchen and a battered women's shelter. Nobody there knew anything about fighter jets. She told them she had been a clerk in the Air Force. That Cessna. It had been a gift from a parishioner, a beat-up old plane that she kept at a public airfield for the occasional charity supply run. She had flown it exactly 4 times. Ace Thorne had never heard any of this. Ace was 32, built like a lacrosse player who discovered beer, and he owned the only hangar bar in the county. A corrugated steel building with a neon sign that read pit stop. He called himself the king of the Kansas sky, and for 5 years running, he had won the local aerobatic competition by a margin that humiliated everyone else. His modified Pitts Special could pull 9 GS, roll 360 degrees in under a second, and climb at 4,000 feet per minute. He had a mohawk haircut, a tattoo of a hornet on his forearm, and an instinct for cruelty that he mistook for confidence. On the morning in question, Ace had just finished a lucrative sponsorship call with an energy drink company. He was in a swaggering mood, ready to perform for the crowd of 20 or so pilots who had driven in for the monthly weekend fly-in. Most of them had brought planes they'd built themselves or restored from scrap. Ace was the star. He spotted the nun the moment she stepped out of her pickup truck. She was tall, black, and walked with the deliberate stride of someone who had never in her life been in a hurry because she had always known exactly where she was going. Her habit was crisp and white and black, and she wore sensible brown sandals. Ace noticed the sandals first, then the Cessna. It was a 1978 Skyhawk with oxidized blue paint, a cracked propeller spinner, and tires that looked like they had been inflated during the Clinton administration. Ace laughed out loud before he even said a word. He nudged the mechanic beside him. "Watch this," he said and walked over, thumbs hooked in his flight jacket, his voice carrying easily in the quiet morning air. "Sister, you look lost. The bingo hall's in town." A few of his buddies chuckled. Sister Mary Clarence didn't flinch. She unlocked the tie-down chain with calm, weathered hands. Ace stepped closer, gesturing at the Skyhawk. "You actually fly that coffin. I put my modified pits against it any day. Name the stakes." That was his signature move, the public challenge. He'd done it a dozen times, humiliated a crop duster, a retired male pilot, and a teenager from Oklahoma who'd built his own kit plane. The crowd began to gather. They knew what was coming next. Someone turned on a phone camera. Sister Mary straightened up and looked at him with a faint, unreadable smile. "How about we settle this in the air?" The laughter around them grew louder, but not from her. Ace spread his arms wide. "All right, sister. Low-altitude race around the county's 3 water towers, full throttle, no handicaps. If you win," he laughed at the absurdity of it, "I'll pay for this heap's annual overhaul and ground my plane for a year. But when I win, you stand in front of the whole hangar and admit that women don't belong in a cockpit." The crowd oohed. Someone called out, "That's cold, Ace." He didn't care. He was already mentally spending the social media attention. Sister Mary folded her hands. "I accept." She walked to the Cessna's door, climbed in, and began her pre-flight check with a speed and precision that no civilian pilot watching had ever witnessed. The young mechanic, a kid named Javi, noticed something odd. She didn't use a checklist. She simply scanned the switches and gauges in a flowing sequence, her lips barely moving, her right hand touching controls that old Cessna pilots never bothered with. Javi squinted, opened his mouth to say something to Ace, then shook his head and stepped back. The congregation of pilots lined up along the grass runway, lawn chairs unfolded, phones out. Ace climbed into his pits and fired the engine, a shout of power that rattled the hangar doors. 30 seconds later, the Skyhawk's propeller coughed, sputtered, and then settled into a steady, rhythmic thrum. As the 2 planes taxied toward the runway, a young girl in the crowd asked her father if the nun was scared. Her father laughed and said, "She's probably praying, honey." She wasn't. In the cockpit of that 1978 Cessna, Major General Vanessa Cross was running a continuous power-off loop calculation in her head, mapping wind shear, ground effect, and the thermal updrafts that had been building since sunrise. She had already studied the water tower locations on a sectional chart, and she had already determined that Ace's lighter plane would eat him alive in a straight climb, but would overheat if she forced him into a sustained high-power turn. The race had not yet begun, but the outcome had already been decided, because a 2-star general does not accept a challenge without having already won its 6 moves in advance. The only question now was how badly Ace Thorne would lose, and for that answer, the whole county would have to watch the smoke. The 2 planes roared down the grass strip, Ace's modified pit surging ahead instantly, its lightweight composite frame and 270 horsepower Lycoming engine catapulting it into a steep climb he'd practiced 1,000 times. By the first water tower, he was 500 feet above her, laughing, his radio mic open. "All right, sister, you see that Cessna in your rearview mirror? Oh wait, you don't have one." His voice crackled with smugness. On the ground, the hangar crowd hooted, phones angled at the sky, already posting humiliating clips of the old nun's plane struggling to gain altitude. But Ace had made a critical error. He had assumed a straight speed trial. The course required a tight, descending hairpin turn around the second water tower, a steel tank perched on a hill with unpredictable crosswinds curling off the adjacent wheat fields. Sister Mary had studied that tower for 4 minutes before takeoff. She knew the Pit Special's fatal flaw. Its short wings gave it astonishing roll rate and climb, but in a sustained high-G bank at low altitude with a hot engine, the oil pressure could drop by 40%. She had seen this exact problem lead to 3 fatal crashes during her years as an Air Force safety investigator, a secondary role she had never mentioned to anyone outside the Pentagon. She entered the turn 20 seconds behind him, throttling back to a precise 75% power, trading speed for the tightest radius her Skyhawk could manage. The old Cessna groaned and shuddered as the turn tightened, but it held the arc with the stubborn, unglamorous loyalty of a machine that had been built before computer modeling existed. Ace threw his pits into the same turn at full throttle, pulling nearly 7 gs, his vision tunneling, the engine screaming at 2,800 RPM. He came out of the turn still ahead, but trailing the first thin, pale thread of smoke from his exhaust manifold. The mechanic, Javi, saw it through binoculars and lowered them slowly. "He's cooking his engine," he said, low enough that only the man beside him heard. "He's not watching his CHT gauge. He's showing off." The third water tower sat on the far side of a county road, a silver sphere marked with a faded sunflower logo. Sister Mary knew, from the Air Force's low-level tactical manuals that had taught her to use terrain masking, that the tower's shadow created a thermal updraft on east-facing slopes after 10 in the morning. The time was 10:15. She banked slightly east of the direct route, flying into the invisible column of warm, rising air, and her rate of climb ticked up without any increase in power. Ace, unaware, flew directly into the downdraft on the other side, and his airspeed bled off. She overtook him. The crowd went silent. All 20 people on the ground stopped what they were doing. Javi grabbed his radio. "Ace, the nun just passed you. I repeat, the nun passed you." Ace's voice came back, panting, incredulous. "What? How? That plane can't climb." But it had. He shoved the throttle forward, over-redlining the engine in a desperate attempt to close the gap. The smoke thickened, a filthy dark plume that scarred the clean Kansas sky. Sister Mary's voice came over the radio for the first time since the start, calm, without a single trace of strain. "Your cylinder head temperature is passing 460 degrees, Mr. Thorne. I'd recommend you reduce power before you lose compression in cylinder number 3. Ace froze. He didn't know her voice. He didn't know how she knew cylinder number 3. He didn't know that a worn piston ring he had been ignoring for 2 months was finally failing. The engine seized 10 seconds later. Not a complete catastrophic failure, but enough of a shuddering, violent loss of oil pressure that he had to pull power immediately. A sputtering, humiliated retreat. Sister Mary crossed the finish line at 50 feet, wings level, engine purring at a frugal 2,300 RPM, exactly as Clyde's Cessna would have wanted. She keyed her mic one final time. "Son, you might want to radio your mechanic. And next time, don't assume the old lady in the habit doesn't know how to use full military power." The landing that followed was witnessed by a county's worth of cell phones. Ace's pits rolled to a stop, trailing a gray fog of burned oil, the prop windmilling unevenly, the engine ticking in the stunned silence like a broken clock. He didn't climb out. He just sat there, forehead pressed to the instrument panel, while his entire belief that talent meant dominance unraveled in real time. Sister Mary parked her Cessna, adjusted her wimple as if she had just returned from a grocery run, and walked toward the crowd, which parted for her as crowds part for people who have just redefined what is possible. A little girl held up her hand for a high five. The nun obliged. Then she walked to morning prayer. Ace Thorne's repair bill, as she had predicted, would later be quoted at $140,000. But the story should have ended there with a local humiliation, a lesson in arrogance, and a quiet nun returning to her soup kitchen. It didn't, because Javi, the mechanic, had gotten a clear recording of the race, and he had also recorded the sound of that voice over the radio. That night, he did what any curious person with a good ear and an internet connection does. He searched military pilot female black general. The results took 11 seconds. A 2002 Air Force Times article. A Pentagon commissioning photograph. Major General Vanessa Cross. The call sign Valkyrie. The biography listed combat time in the Gulf, Bosnia, Afghanistan, her retirement date, no public mention of a convent. He scrolled, heart hammering. Then he did what he would later describe to a reporter as either the bravest or most reckless act of his life. He uploaded the video with the title, "Hotshot Pilot Challenges Nun to Air Race. Nun is Retired 2-Star General." Video hit 2 million views before sunrise. By the time the clock hit noon the following day, a local news van was parked outside the Sisters of the Immaculate Heart. A young reporter named Tamara Cole had used property records, the tail number of the Cessna, and a single faded Air Force photo from 1998 to connect the nun to the general. The Mother Superior, a gentle woman named Sister Agnes, answered the door in visible confusion. Sister Mary, a general? That can't be. She told us she filed paperwork. Behind her in the chapel, Sister Mary Clarence, Colonel Vanessa Cross, was kneeling at the altar, her hands folded, her face utterly serene. She had not told them. She had changed her name, her life, her call sign, hoping the Pentagon's vast bureaucracy would swallow her trail. But the Pentagon does not forget its generals, and neither does the internet. Within 48 hours, the story had moved from viral clip to national headline. A retired Air Force general now living as a cloistered nun. That was a human interest goldmine. But then the second wave hit. Someone, somewhere, leaked the real reason for her resignation in 2003. It wasn't the water towers. It wasn't a spiritual awakening. Those had been true, but they were not why she left. The real reason was contained in a classified after-action report she had written after a botched airstrike in the no-fly zone over Kirkuk in 2002. Her squadron had been ordered to fire on what command insisted was a mobile missile launcher. General Cross had refused. Her refusal on moral grounds had cost her career. The report, now in the hands of a blogger who had obtained it through a FOIA request that had disappeared into a back-channel settlement years ago, revealed that the target had been a civilian water truck. The blog post was titled, "The Nun Who Saved a Village: Why the Air Force Buried a Hero." And when Ace Thorne, still smoldering in the wreckage of his shattered ego, read it, he found the one straw that might let him reclaim a shred of dignity. The report mentioned that the refusal had created a rift in the chain of command, and that General Cross had been accused of insubordination by a deputy who later rose to a senior role at the Pentagon. Ace's cousin was a junior associate at a defense contractor law firm. He made a call. The call was short, but the implication was long. If they could prove the nun had lied on her convent application, or that her past made her unfit for religious life under the church's new safeguarding norms, they could destroy the woman who had humiliated him without ever having to refly that race. Sister Mary knelt in the chapel and heard the news van outside. She didn't turn. She had spent 3 decades keeping her promise to protect the people of that Iraqi village by burying what she knew. Now, because of an arrogant pilot and a phone camera, a door she had sealed shut was cracking open. And on the other side of that door, men who had wanted her silence for 20 years were about to realize she was still breathing. Act 2, A, wasn't just about a race anymore. It was about the cost of choosing conscience over command, and a woman who had once controlled the sky now had to defend her soul on the ground. And the only person who held all the evidence, the full after-action report, the witness statements, the truth the Pentagon had paid to suppress, was a mechanic named Javi who had no idea that the USB drive he'd found in the Cessna's glove box when he went to inspect the engine contained far more than just a pilot's log. Javi sat in his cramped apartment above the hangar, the USB drive plugged into his laptop, and he didn't sleep for 36 hours. The drive contained no pilot logs. It held the original, unredacted after-action report from March 17, 2002. The one General Cross had filed through back channels because her direct superior had ordered her to alter it. The report described the water truck in granular precision: color, license plate, estimated civilian occupancy. It included satellite coordinates that contradicted the intelligence assessment she had been given. And attached to it, like a bomb with a 20-year fuse, was a voice memo. The recording captured a phone call between herself and Colonel Marcus Webb, the Pentagon liaison who had pressured her to strike anyway. His voice, tinny but unmistakable: "Cross, this isn't a debate. Command needs the hit. If you can't do it, I'll find someone who will, and your career ends tonight." She had refused. Webb had followed through on his threat. Within 6 months, she was quietly pushed into retirement while Webb received a Defense Superior Service Medal and a promotion to Brigadier General. The official narrative: Cross had been emotionally compromised, unfit for command. The informal rumor spread through Pentagon corridors: she had lost her nerve. The truth, now glowing on Javi's screen. She had chosen not to incinerate 37 civilians, most of them children fetching water for their families. And the woman they had labeled unstable had, in the quiet dignity of her convent cell, carried that secret without ever once defending herself publicly. But the USB drive held one more document, and this is where the story swerves from a case of buried heroism into something genuinely terrifying. It was a memo dated 8 months after her retirement, stamped with the seal of the Office of the Inspector General, and it had been classified at the highest level. The memo detailed a formal investigation into Colonel Marcus Webb for war crimes. Specifically, the strike that Cross had refused to carry out was still executed, 3 days later, by a pilot who had been given a falsified target package. The water truck was destroyed. Everyone inside was killed. An internal review had found that Webb knowingly doctored the intelligence, but before the investigation could be completed, the file was closed. Closed by a senior official whose name Javi had to read 3 times before believing it. The name was now a sitting U.S. congressman. Javi understood immediately that he wasn't holding a story. He was holding a legal nuclear device. He called his sister, a public defender in Topeka, at 4 in the morning. "I need you to tell me what to do with evidence of a war crime," he said. She told him to bring it to her office and not tell anyone else. But Ace's cousin, the defense contractor lawyer, had already filed a motion that morning, a desperate Hail Mary to discredit Sister Mary. He alleged that she had obtained her pilot's license under a false identity and that any aircraft she flew was uninsured, and he served the convent with a civil suit for endangerment and fraud. The local news ran the story. Nuns passed under investigation. Was the race a danger to public safety? Sister Mary, kneeling in the chapel, heard Sister Agnes whisper the news. For the first time in 20 years, tears slid down her face. Not from fear, from exhaustion. The exhaustion of a woman who had given up everything to protect the innocent and was now being hunted by the very system she had once served. She rose, walked to the Mother Superior's office, and placed a single phone call to a number she had memorized in 2003. The number connected to a retired JAG officer in Virginia who had once told her, "If they ever come for you, call me." His name was Lawrence O'Donnell. He listened for 12 minutes without interrupting. Then he said, "General, it's time to stop hiding." The next morning, the world woke up to a press release from O'Donnell's office, now acting as Sister Mary's legal counsel. It announced that Major General Vanessa Cross, call sign Valkyrie, would hold a press conference at the Kansas state capitol in 2 days. It would address not only the air race and the civil suit, but a 20-year injustice originating at the highest levels of the United States military. The convent phone rang off the hook. The congressman's office issued a statement calling the allegations baseless and politically motivated. Ace Thorne, watching from his hangar, realized he had just accidentally kicked a hornet's nest that could swallow him whole. But the worst revelation was still coming, because as Javi's sister began vetting the documents, she discovered a metadata stamp in the voice memo file that proved it had been copied off a Pentagon server less than 6 months ago. Not 20 years ago. 6 months ago. Someone inside the Department of Defense had accessed the original file recently. Someone was already watching. Someone knew the truth could still come out. And that meant Sister Mary hadn't just been living a quiet life of service. She had been living under active surveillance, waiting for a knock she prayed would never arrive. The knock was now a battering ram, and the person swinging it wasn't Ace Thorne. It was a ghost from her past who had just learned she was still alive and was about to learn she was no longer silent. The press conference was held at 10 in the morning on the steps of the Kansas state capitol, and 300 journalists crammed the lawn. Sister Mary Clarence walked to the microphone in her habit, but when she spoke, it was the voice of Major General Vanessa Cross. She began, 20 years ago, I was ordered to kill 37 innocent people. I refused. For that, I lost my career, my reputation, and very nearly my faith. She then read the after-action report aloud, word by word, into the silent cameras. She played the voice memo. She named Colonel Marcus Webb. She named the congressman. She named the falsified target package. And then she said, I have carried this alone because the people who committed these crimes are still in power. I am no longer carrying it alone. The room, the state, exploded. The congressman resigned within 72 hours, his statement blaming unfair partisan attacks before his lawyer cut him off. The Department of Defense announced a full reinvestigation into the Kirkuk incident, with the Inspector General citing credible new evidence. Colonel Webb, now elderly and living in a gated community in Florida, was served with a subpoena while playing golf. The pilot who had taken the strike, a man who had lived with nightmares for 2 decades, called O'Donnell's office and offered to testify. He had been told the water truck was a military target. He had believed his superiors. He had never recovered. But the most devastating moment came when a woman in her early 30s, a journalist who had followed the story from an Iraqi refugee camp, stepped forward with a photograph. She handed it to Sister Mary on the Capitol steps. It showed a group of children standing beside a water truck, smiling. One of them, a boy in a red shirt, held a soccer ball. The journalist said, "That boy is my brother. He survived because the strike was called off. Our family has been searching for you for 20 years." Sister Mary, the woman who had never cried in a cockpit under fire, who had calmly faced down a hotshot pilot and a corrupt chain of command, broke. She knelt on the stone steps, still in her habit, and wept. The cameras captured it all. That photograph became the defining image of the story. Back in Wichita, Ace Thorne watched the footage from his hangar. His lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice. The energy drink company dropped him. The local pilots association revoked his membership. He posted a video apology looking hollowed out, admitting, "I thought I was the king of the sky. I was just a fool with a loud engine." It barely made the news. He was a footnote now. The real headline was the nun. Sister Agnes held a meeting with the entire convent. Sister Mary finally told them the truth, the full truth, from fighter jets to buried war crimes. When she finished, Sister Agnes stood, walked over, and hugged her. Then she said, "We prayed beside you because you were one of us. Now we know we were praying beside a prophet." The convent didn't ask her to leave. They asked her to teach them to fly. She laughed, a deep, full laugh that echoed through the chapel for the first time in decades. She didn't fly the Cessna much after that. She didn't need to. But every so often, Javi would see her at the airfield, just sitting in the cockpit, reading a book, the engine silent, her wimple tucked neatly under her headset. The USB drive's final document turned out to be a personal letter from Javi's sister. She had traced the metadata back to a young Pentagon clerk who had stumbled on the file 6 months earlier and, terrified but morally certain, had downloaded it and hidden it in the Cessna's glove box when she discovered the plane belonged to Cross. The clerk, a 25-year-old named Rosa, had visited the airfield on a hunch. She had slipped the drive into the plane, hoping the nun would find it. Instead, Javi found it. And that in the end was the true engine of the story. Not the race, not the general, but a chain of ordinary people. A mechanic, a public defender, a Pentagon clerk, a journalist who refused to look away. So what started as a cocky pilot mocking an old nun beside a beat-up Cessna became a reckoning with war crimes committed 20 years earlier and the quiet heroism of a woman who had given up her entire life to protect the innocent. It was never about an air race. It was about what happens when someone with absolute power is told no by someone with absolute conscience, and about a sky full of fighter jets that never dropped their bombs because a single woman in the heat of a no-fly zone chose humanity over orders. Sister Mary Clarence, formerly Major General Vanessa Cross, call sign Valkyrie, still lives in the convent. She still prays at morning mass. And sometimes, when the Kansas wind blows just right, she looks up and smiles, remembering a plume of black smoke trailing from a push-too-hard engine, and a young pilot who learned that the sky doesn't belong to the arrogant. It belongs to the brave. Somewhere out there right now, someone is being underestimated, told they don't belong in the cockpit, the boardroom, the conversation, dismissed because of how they look, how they speak, what they wear, or who the world has decided they are. Sister Mary Clarence walked onto that dusty Kansas airfield looking like a woman the world had already filed away. What the world didn't know, and what Ace Thorne learned in the time it takes an engine to seize, is that the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous one to underestimate. She didn't just beat him. She reminded an entire country that a habit can hide a general, that a beat-up Cessna can outfly a stunt plane, and that a woman who has faced down war criminals is not going to flinch at a man with a loud mouth and a louder engine. The thing they keep telling you is your weakness, the thing you've been hiding. What if it's not a liability? What if it's exactly the thing that, the moment you stop apologizing for it, changes everything? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story moved something in you tonight, send it to one person who needs to be reminded that the sky is bigger than anyone's assumptions. If you're not subscribed yet, stay close. There's another story coming next week that I honestly cannot wait to tell you. Until then, may you always fly with the wind at your back and the truth on your side.